want to start this episode by asking you something, and I actually want you to stop and think about it for just a second. When was the last time a story genuinely unsettled you? Not just, oh, that was creepy. I mean the kind of unsettled where you put the book down and just sat there for a second. Or you finished the movie and you were quiet in the car on the way home. Or even you read something and you couldn't shake it for days. I'm talking about stories that stay. Hold on to that, because that's what this whole episode is about. We're going to be talking about horror today, why it matters, what it's actually doing when it works, and why I think it's one of the most important genres in all of fiction, not just to me as a writer, but to all of us as people navigating a world that can be genuinely terrifying sometimes. And yeah, I know, some of you probably just rolled your eyes, some of you are already thinking, I don't like horror, and yes, that's fine, I promise we'll get to that. But I am willing to bet money that almost every single one of you engages with it in some form without really thinking about it as horror. True crime, psychological thrillers, dark drama, folk tales, the stuff that keeps you up at night in a way that isn't entirely unpleasant. Horror is older than almost any other storytelling tradition we have, and there are good reasons for that. So, let's get into it. Welcome back to Ink and Entropy. I'm Connor Mancuso, writer, horror enthusiast, perpetual wanderer of the maze, and poet laureate for VCCS. This is episode 2 of my podcast series exploring anything and everything horror and horror related. Episode 1 is out there, and if you took the time to stop and listen to that, I am very grateful to you. If you're new here, welcome. You picked a good episode to start with because this one is pretty close to me. A quick note, though, before we dive in, this episode is going to be a bit longer than my last episode, and this will probably be the format going forward, but we shall see how it goes. And this is because I think this topic deserves the space. Horror is not just something I can skim. I've been writing it, studying it, and thinking about it for a long time throughout my life, and I wanted to actually do it justice in the best way I can, rather than just scratch the surface. So grab a coffee, go for a walk, whatever you need to do to settle in, this one is worth the time. Okay, so I want to address the elephant in the room first, because I know it's there. A lot of people say they don't like horror, and I get it. I really do. There is a version of horror that is just cheap jump scares that exist only to spike our adrenaline, gore for shock's value with nothing underneath it, villains with no interiority, victims with no personality. You sit through 90 minutes of a film or read a book or short story and you feel vaguely gross at the end and you think, that's what horror is? No thanks. But here's the thing. That's like saying you don't like food because once you had a really bad gas station sandwich. You see, category is not the problem, because here is what I actually mean when I talk about horror, and what I'll be talking about for this episode. I'm talking about the horror that lingers, the horror that's about something, the horror that uses fear the way any great piece of literature uses any other emotion, as a lever to open up something true about human experience. Think about The Haunting of Hill House, both the book and the show. That's not really only about ghosts. It also is about grief. It's about what trauma does to a family over generations. The house is terrifying, but the real horror is watching people destroy each other and themselves because they can't figure out how to carry the weight of what happens to them. Think about Get Out. Phenomenal horror movie. The movie scared a lot of people on a visceral level, but the reason it hit so hard and the reason it was talked about in the way that it was because it was capturing something real, a very specific, very documented kind of racial anxiety, a fear that is not fictional for a lot of people. Horror was the vehicle. Social truth was the cargo. Think about Shirley Jackson. Think about Poe. Think about the quiet devastation of the yellow wallpaper. Think about Annihilation, which is one of, but not number one, but one of the most existentially unsettling pieces of fiction that I've read in a long time. Granted, I've read this a while ago. But none of those things are relying on cheap tricks. They're doing something deliberate and careful and intelligent with that fear. That is what I mean when I say horror. And by that definition, I do think that in some way almost everyone does like horror, but they just don't always call it that. You see, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why horror works on us the way it does, because I think this is actually the most interesting part, or one of the most interesting parts, and it doesn't get talked about enough outside of academic circles, lofty writing clubs, tight-knit circles. There's research, but I will keep it accessible, I promise. I'm a writer, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a researcher. But there is research that frames horror as a kind of threat simulation, the idea being that when you engage with a scary story, your brain is doing something that serves an evolutionary purpose. It's rehearsing, it's practicing how to respond to danger in a context where the danger isn't real. And that might sound a little clinical, but if you sit with it for a moment and really think about it, it actually is beautiful in an almost cerebral sort of way. Think about it this way. Every emotion we experience serves as a function. Grief exists to help us process loss. Anger exists to signal that something is wrong. And fear exists to keep us alive. These aren't bugs. They are fundamental features of the human experience and our emotions. But the problem with fear specifically is that it is really hard to practice in low-stakes environment in a real-world setting that is safe. You can't just conjure up those dangers safely to test the response you're going to have to those different types of emotion and fear responses. But that's what fiction can do. You see, when you're watching a horror movie and our heart rate is getting up, it's going up to the ceiling, and you're gripping at the armrest and you feel that crawling dread creeping up your spine, our body, our nervous system is genuinely responding to something, not because it doesn't know that the movie is fake or that the book isn't real and it's just words on a paper, but because the emotional experience is real, even when the stimulus itself isn't. And going through that experience, feeling that fear, sitting in the discomfort and letting it resolve, it actually does something for you and for us. It gives all of us a way to exercise responses to stress and danger and the unknown that you would otherwise never get to be able to deal with and practice in a safe setting. I like to think of it kind of like a fire drill for our emotions. And you leave the theater, or you close the book, slightly more prepared for those things than you were before, even if you never consciously think of it that way. But I think it goes even further than that for me personally, because horror doesn't just stimulate external danger, it also gives shape to that internal stuff sitting inside. You know, kind of like that feeling of dread that doesn't have a clear source, or a free-floating anxiety that attaches itself to everything. That grief that sits in our chest like something is occupying space. In there that you can't quite name or locate. Horror is one of the only art forms that will look at all of that directly, and it won't sanitize it, or resolve it too quickly, or wrap it in something comfortable that will put a face on it. And there is something deeply, genuinely cathartic about that. About watching a film or reading a story, and it externalizes something that we've been carrying internally. Because when we can see it, when it has shape, a name, a form, it becomes something that we can actually engage with, even if that engagement is terrifying to us. Horror is able to hold up a mirror to the worst of what we feel and say, yes, this is real, and you are not broken for feeling it. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm human just like the rest of us, and I have definitely needed that more than once in my life, because regardless of how well off we are or how difficult our life is, we all have those negative emotions and experiences. So having that connection and a way to internalize and process it is definitely a relieving feeling. And look, I know that I'm saying this as someone who writes horror, so obviously I'm not necessarily the most biased or neutral party here. I'm not, again, unbiased in the perfect sense, but I didn't start writing horror because I wanted it to scare people. Although writing horror, that is a sub-concept of that. I started writing horror because I had things I was trying to say that I couldn't figure out how to say in any other way of writing. The darkness isn't not just a decoration, it's a point of access, and it's the way in. But more on that later when we talk about the craft. I just wanted to be upfront about where this is coming from in a as real as I can get way. But we will be right back talking about the culture of horror after this short ad break. Are you looking for your next horror read? Is your to-be-read list running out? Well, allow me to introduce to you your potential next horror read. When the Black Star Sang, Tales from the Void by Conor Mancuso is a collection of 31 short stories. 31 Nights, 31 Descents. This collection gathers a month of original horror into one volume of cosmic dread, ritual darkness, and quiet catastrophes that creep under the skin and stay there. The world doesn't just end with fire, it ends with a whisper, a door left open, a name spoken, the wrong way. Read it if you crave horror that feels vast, intimate, and inevitable. Stories that will not just scare you, but follow you. Do you have a story that you want to spread to the world, but don't really know necessarily where to send it to? Consider checking out the Oblivion Index literary horror magazine on Substack. It is a small group online publication horror literary magazine created and run by horror author Conor Mancuso and a small team of dedicated, amazing authors and editors. You can find out more about that and more about updates on Conor Mancuso's writing, works, and updates at his Substack, conormancuso.substack.com. Again, that is conormancuso.substack.com. Now, let's get back to the show. And welcome back to Ink and Entropy, your new favorite horror podcast. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about what horror does psychologically and as well as what it does on an individual level. Now I want to zoom out just a little bit because this is where it gets really interesting to me personally. Talking about how horror is a cultural mirror. Every generation, regardless of where you go, every era, every moment in history, they produce the horror stories they need. And if you pay attention to what those stories are actually about, you're looking at a very honest record of what that particular society and time period was afraid about. Not just surface fears, deep fears. The stuff people couldn't talk about directly in polite company or public discourse, but that was sitting underneath everything like a building pressure. So let me walk through this because it's wild when you actually lay it out. And it's a fascinating topic to get into, and I highly recommend, if you don't know anything about the cultural significance of horror, to kind of look into it. We have Gothic horror, talking about Shelley, Stoker, Le Fanu, Radcliffe. A lot of that orbits around death, the unknown, the transgression of natural boundaries. Frankenstein is about the anxiety of playing God, about what happens when science moves faster than ethics. Published in 1818, right at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, right when humanity was starting to understand that we could reshape the world in ways that might be irreversible. That's not a coincidence. That's culture processing fear through story. Then we move to the mid-20th century, post-World War II. We suddenly have an explosion of creature features, monster movies, invasion narratives, giant bugs, and things from the skies. Things from the deep that crawl out onto shore and destroy cities. And you know what all those are about? Nuclear anxiety, the atom bomb, the Cold War, a terrifying realization that what humans had built is something that could end us all. And now we kind of just have to live with that. The monsters in those stories are almost always mutations from radiation. I mean, take a look at Godzilla, one of the most notable horror monster movies ever created. Or things arriving from stars, or even things awakening from the deep after centuries of dormancy because we disturbed something we shouldn't have touched. I'm looking at you, Cthulhu. That is nuclear age paranoia wearing a rubber suit. And then moving even more further forward, we have the slashers of the 70s and 80s. Things like Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Pinhead. And this is where it gets a little more complicated because a lot of those films have real problems. But the genre at its core was born out of this cultural anxiety about the suburbs, about the illusion of safety, about the American dream as a kind of lie that hides something violent or sick underneath. You see, the monster isn't the swamp or the alien, it's the man next door. The monster looks like you. The danger is inside the house, inside the neighborhood, inside the family. That's Vietnam. That's Watergate. That's a generation that was told things were fine and found out very clearly that things were in fact not fine. And then we fast forward even further to where we are at now currently. Contemporary horror, social horror. What's the genre obsessed with right now? Trauma, identity, systemic forces, the horror of powerlessness in the face of something enormous and institutional, the horror of not being believed, the horror of the body betraying itself, of inheritance, the sins of fathers quite literally haunting children, Hereditary, Midsommar, His House, The Witch. And that's just movies. That's not even getting into books. And so much of the most acclaimed horror in the last decade, is doing something very specific. It's asking what happens when the thing threatening you isn't a monster you can fight, but a system, a family structure, a history that precedes you and shapes you whether you want it to or not. That's not an accident. That's a contemporary culture doing what horror has always done. And horror tells us what we are afraid of. Not the sanitized version, but the real version. And that makes it, in my opinion, one of the most important documentary arts that we have, because it captures what we are actually feeling in a way that official history rarely does. I think about this a lot while working on my own writing, because when I'm working on something, and some of you have been following along with the work I've been doing on my past books, on the current novella I'm working on, and all of my upcoming work, and I'm always asking myself, what is this actually about? What is the horror in service of? What is the truth? And what truth does it need to be carrying? Because if the answer is nothing, it's just scary, then I haven't done my job. The fear has to be the vehicle, not just the destination. So now we're getting to the part that I think about most as a writer, because everything we've talked about so far, the psychology, the cultural function, all of that is really fascinating and interesting, but it also exists somewhere outside of the work itself. This is about the work, about what horror does to storytelling at the craft level. And here's the claim I want to make. Horror is one of the most honest genres in fiction. Not because it's realistic. Let's be honest, obviously it's not. I'm sure most of you have read and watched some pretty outlandish horror media in your life. But because of what it requires from a story to work is what makes it realistic. Now, here's what I mean. Horror, when it's done well, strips characters down to their most fundamental selves, because fear that does that, extreme circumstances do that. Because fear does that, extreme circumstances do that. When your character is truly in danger, real danger, existential danger, the kind of danger where everything could end, you can't hide behind anything anymore. All the social performance falls away, all the comfortable masks come off, and what's left is who that person actually is. That's pretty hard to achieve in a realistic literary story. You have to do a lot of careful and patient work to get a character to the point of genuine revelation. Horror creates those conditions almost automatically when done right and when done well. And a good horror story will use that, and it will let you see a character completely in the way that people only fully visibly see it at their most desperate and honest selves. And the themes that horror is naturally suited to explore, again, things like morality, guilt, obsession, the weight of history, failure of love, the thing that you did that you can never truly undo, those are central themes of the best literary fiction in the world. Horror just approaches them from a different angle, an angle almost that I would argue often gets closer to the truth, not further from it. This is because horror doesn't flinch. That's the thing. That's the essential quality to it. Most storytelling, even really good storytelling, will find a way to soften the landing a little bit, to give you some air. Horror walks you straight and directly into that fire, into the oven, directly into the thing that's the hardest to look at, and it stays there. It does not let you leave early, unless you walk away from the story or movie. And I think that's what creates the lasting quality that I mentioned at the very beginning of this episode. The stories that stay with you are the stories that looked at something honestly. Horror at its best does that. It demands honesty from itself, and it demands honesty from you and I. But I want to talk about something a little specific here, because I think it illustrates what I mean better than anything abstract or metaphorical that I could say. There's a moment in The Haunting of Hill House, the book, not the show, though the show earns its own conversation. There's a moment where the character Eleanor is lying in a bed in the house, and she realizes that she's been waiting for this place her whole life, that it feels more like a home than any place she's ever lived, that she belongs there in this terrible, malevolent, impossible place. That is not a horror beat designed to make you afraid in the traditional sense of fear in modern horror. It's a horror beat that breaks your heart, because what Shirley Jackson is doing there is writing about loneliness so complete that a haunted house feels like a home. She's writing about what it means to have lived your whole life without belonging anywhere, that it's not a small thing, she's saying. That is one of the most That is one of the most devastating things a writer has ever said, in my opinion. And she could only say it in horror. Or at least that's the argument I'm giving. Because the genre gave her the architecture for it. The haunted house, the heroine who's drawn to the darkness, the slow dissolution of self. That's the form. And she used the form to say something heartbreakingly true. That's what I mean when I say horror is honest. That's what I mean when I say it goes places other genres cannot always follow or always follow effectively. But now I want to get a little personal, because I would be doing this episode a disservice if I just stayed purely theoretical, hypothetical, metaphorical. I've talked about horror as a genre. I've talked about horror as a cultural artifact. I've talked about horror as a craft tool. But why do I write it? Why is it the thing that I keep coming back to? And to be honest, this could be an entire episode in and of itself. A very long one. But the honest answer is that I started writing horror because I needed somewhere to put things and a way for people to understand that the darker sides of humanity and emotions can be translated and experienced in that safe environment to better understand those things that we are experiencing. Not in a dark crisis kind of way. I want to be as clear about that as I can be. But in the way that I think a lot of writers come to their particular territory. You write what you can't stop thinking about. You write towards things that feel unresolved, and for me, a lot of those things lived in darkness, in the spaces between what was said and what was meant. Almost in a way that loss changes people. In ways that fear and love are almost the same thing in the body and in the ways the past follows us. Horror, even before I started writing it, gave me a language for all of that. And I think that's part of the reason why I'm so resistant to the idea that horror is somehow any lesser or immature or just entertainment for people who like to be grossed out. Because my experience of writing it has been anything but that. It really, to me, has been some of the most searching, most honest, and most emotionally demanding work I've done. Because it requires things from me that other kinds of writing don't do. It requires me to really dig down deep into the emotional core of who I am. When I'm working on any project in particular, let's just take my novella I'm writing, for instance. And I have talked a little bit about that on my Substack. There's a couple articles I've written about that, if you're interested in that. So for those of you who follow along over there, you know about it. If you don't, please feel free to check that out. But the thing I keep coming back to is this question. Where does the horror live? Not in the plot, not in the monster, or monsters, or whatever the antagonist may be, if there is one. The horror lives in the character, or characters. It lives in the way that character or characters is afraid to confront. And in the slow, almost terrible process of the story forcing them to confront it anyway. That's the job. That's always the job. Or at least that's how I view it. And I think horror uniquely is a genre that will not let you outsource that job to simple spectacle. You really can paper over a lot of things with a cool monster, an interesting plot, a well-written villain. But if the horror isn't rooted in something true about the human at the center of the story, I feel in some ways it almost doesn't work. And the reader or the audience can feel it. Something just goes almost hollow. Which means horror writers, we have to be honest, particularly about fear, grief, about the things that keep us up at night for reasons that have nothing to do with monsters. And I find that challenge genuinely compelling. I don't want to write away from the hard stuff. I want to write directly at it. I want to scare people because I write horror, but I want my readers to walk away feeling almost a fear response that is fundamentally ingrained into their very beings. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. We've covered the psychology, whether that is horror as an emotional rehearsal, as the way of giving shape to the internal fears. We've covered the culture, craft. But now, I want to zoom all the way out, as far as I can go. And I want to ask the biggest version of the question, why? Why what? Why does horror survive? There's a couple ways you can answer this, and depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer. So this is going to be my answer. Why does it persist across every culture, every era, every form of storytelling we've ever invented? Because it does, by the way. Because it does, by the way. This is not modern genre. Horror is prehistoric. Humans were telling stories to each other designed to frighten long before anything we could recognize as literature. Myths about monsters in the deep, warnings about the dark, stories about what happens to those who transgress or wander too far, or who disturb what should be left alone. Fear is maybe one of the oldest common languages that we have. It survives across all cultures, all languages, and all barriers. And precisely because of that, I think that's why it survives, because fear is universal in a way that almost nothing else is, with the exception of two things, that being hope and love. Cultures are different, values are different, but what's funny in one context doesn't always land in another. What's beautiful in one tradition may not always have an equivalent elsewhere, even though it's still beautiful. But fear maps onto almost everything human. We've all experienced loss in some form. We've all experienced the unknown in some form, and we've all experienced the body's eventual failure in some form. We all experience the gap between what we can control and can't control. And horror is the art form built entirely on that gap. And the stories that have endured, the ones that get passed down, the ones that become classics, the ones that still feel alive 100 or 200 years after they were written, they are the ones that used fear to say something true, not just scary. True. That's the test. Actually, in some ways, depending on how I'm writing or what I'm writing, that's how I evaluate horror as both a reader and a writer. Is it true? Not factually, emotionally. Does it capture something real about the experience of being alive in a body, in a world, in a time? Does it say something about grief, about power, about what we can and can't survive, about what we do to each other and to ourselves? If it does, it's probably horror that matters. And if it matters, it's probably horror that's going to stick. And it'll probably be one of the ones that stays. So that was a lot. And a lot of this was personal opinion and allegory and metaphorical and hypothetical. But I wanted to talk about it because of how important horror is to me. Now, I want to bring us back to where we started, because I always, or at least recently I feel like one of the best ways to end conversations is to end them where they began, just at a different sort of elevation. I asked you guys at the beginning of this episode to think about the last time a story genuinely unsettled you, the last time something stayed with you, and now I want all of us to revisit that with everything that I've talked about in between. That feeling, that lingering quality, that's not a sign that something disturbed you in a harmful way. Usually, it's a sign that the story reached something real inside you. It touched a nerve that was already there. It gave shape to something that was already in you, just waiting for the right words to be spoken or read. That's what horror does at its best. Again, I know I keep saying it, but it does. It doesn't just scare you. It reveals you. It shows what you've been carrying, what you're running from, and what you and I have been quietly afraid of in a way that we haven't quite been able to articulate. It makes the internal external, and then it asks you to sit with it. Not to resolve it necessarily, but to just look at it. And I think in a kind of a strange way, it's courageous, honestly. Both the making of it and the experiencing of it. There's a real courage in deciding to look directly at the dark rather than away from it. Horror matters because fear matters. Because the things we're afraid of, they tell us what we value. They tell us what we love and what we can't afford to lose, and the stories that take those fears seriously, that treat them as worthy craft and care honestly, those are the stories that end up saying the most about what it means to be human. And that's why I write horror. And it's also why I think that you should keep the lights on for just a little while longer. All right, everyone, so that's going to do it for episode 2 of Ink and Entropy. If this episode hit for you in any way, I would genuinely love to hear about it. What horror has stayed with you? What's the story that we talked about that you still think about? Drop it in the comments, send me a message. You can find me on Instagram or over on Substack. I do read everything. I may take a while to respond to everything, but I do read everything, and I do love that conversation. If you're not already following me on Substack, it's Ink and Entropy over at connormancuso.substack.com. Again, that's connormancuso.substack.com, and you'll find that I post fiction, essays on my craft, updates on what I'm working on, and the novella and novel and poetry collection I'm working on. It is moving slowly and carefully, and as I continue developing it, I will be talking more about it. Next episode, we'll keep wandering further into horror. I'm not going to say too much yet about what we're going to be doing yet. But if this episode was the why of horror, then there will be a part 2 coming that I think you're going to want to hear. Anyway, I just want to say thank you for being here. Really, it means more to me than I can say. But until next time.